What if I told you there's a growing conversation about states rethinking their place in the United States? Imagine the ripple effects of such a bold move. While it might sound far-fetched, this idea is gaining traction in unexpected ways. From cultural divides to economic debates, the reasons behind this shift are as complex as they are fascinating. But what's driving this conversation, and how serious is it? Stick around, because we're diving into the surprising factors fueling this discussion, and the implications they could have for the future of the nation. You won't want to miss this. A surprisingly close neighbor, Vermont's Canada connection. Alright, let's talk about Vermont. Peaceful, rural, tucked away in the Northeast, and now, apparently ready to ditch the United States? It might sound wild at first, but when you dig a little deeper, it starts to make sense. Vermont feels like it exists in its own world. With its rolling green hills, iconic red barns, and a population that values small-town independence over big-city chaos, the state has carved out a unique identity. But it's not just the landscape, it's the values. Vermont's progressive policies and commitment to sustainability set it apart from much of the country, making it feel more like a lone maple tree in a Canadian forest. Culturally and politically, Vermont has more in common with Canada than most of the U.S. Let's break it down. Vermont has long been a leader in progressive policies, like being the first state to legalize same-sex civil unions in 2000, years ahead of the national curve on LGBTQ+ rights. The state is also aggressive in tackling climate change, investing heavily in renewable energy and passing strict environmental laws to protect its forests and lakes. These priorities give Vermont a Scandinavian vibe, and where do we see similar values? Right across the border in Canada. Take healthcare, for example. Vermont has tried for years to implement its own version of universal healthcare. In 2014, the state came close with Green Mountain Care, a state-funded single-payer system, but financial challenges forced them to abandon the plan. Still, the idea of affordable healthcare remains popular among Vermonters. Meanwhile, Canada already has universal healthcare in place. For many in Vermont, especially as medical costs rise nationwide, it's easy to look north and wonder, why can't we be part of that? The tension between Vermont and federal policies has only deepened in recent years. Vermont voters lean heavily left, it's the home state of Bernie Sanders, after all. During the Trump administration, the divide became especially stark. On issues like climate change, healthcare, and immigration, Vermont seemed to operate in a completely different reality from Washington. In 2017, the state even announced it would stick to the Paris Climate Agreement after the federal government pulled out. These moments highlight Vermont's independent streak and its frustration with being out of step with national priorities. But it's not just about politics. Vermont's small size, just over 600,000 people, means its voice often gets drowned out in national debates. For some, the idea of aligning with a country like Canada, which values smaller, more localized governance, feels like a natural fit. Geographically, the connection is already there. Vermont sits right on Canada's border, and many residents make regular trips north, whether for skiing, visiting family, or even buying cheaper prescription medications. The proximity fosters a sense of familiarity, but the cultural affinity runs even deeper. Vermont's outdoorsy, eco-conscious population would blend seamlessly with places like British Columbia or Quebec, where environmental sustainability and preserving natural beauty are priorities. Add in the slower, rural lifestyle and even the occasional Tim Hortons coffee and donut moment, and Vermont starts to feel like Canada's long-lost cousin. So, how do Vermonters feel about all this? We surveyed 500 residents and asked if they'd consider leaving the U.S. The results? 265 people, over half, said yes. And where did most of them want to go? Canada. A full 78% of those interested in leaving saw our northern neighbor as their dream destination. These numbers reveal a deeper truth: Vermont's identity already feels halfway across the border. Its values, culture, and even its frustrations with federal policies align more closely with Canada than with much of the U.S. But is this practical, or just a fantasy? Vermont's small size could make independence challenging, especially when it comes to infrastructure, trade, or national defense. Aligning with an existing country like Canada might make more sense than going it alone. On the other hand, the political and logistical hurdles to secession are enormous, and the federal government wouldn't exactly roll out the red carpet. Still, the numbers don't lie. Over half of Vermonters we surveyed expressed interest in leaving the U.S., and the idea of flying a maple leaf flag alongside Vermont's Green Mountain iconography doesn't seem so far-fetched. While secession might not happen anytime soon, Vermont's unique identity makes it easy to imagine the state looking northward for inspiration, or even a new home. But Vermont isn't the only state with eyes on Canada. While it's small and quirky, other states, bigger ones, are also dreaming of greener pastures up north. Let's move on to Oregon, because their numbers will surprise you even more. Why Oregon wants to pack up and head north. Oregon isn't quirky in the same way Vermont is, it's a different kind of unique. Picture Portland's streets, murals on every corner, coffee shops that double as art galleries, and bike lanes packed with commuters pedaling past food trucks serving vegan tacos. It's a place where bumper stickers proudly declare, "Keep Portland Weird," and community gardens thrive alongside artisanal kombucha stands. But lately, Oregon might be gearing up to take its individuality to a whole new level, by leaving the United States and heading north to join Canada. At first, it sounds far-fetched, but when you dig into Oregon's culture, priorities, and frustrations with federal policies, the idea starts to feel surprisingly plausible. Let's dive into what makes Oregon tick. The state is a hub of progressive ideals, eco-conscious living, and a fiercely independent spirit. Portland, for example, is a magnet for people who love thrift shops, farmers markets, and sustainable living. It's not just a city, it's a lifestyle. Public transit, bike culture, and urban green spaces are woven into daily life. Now, compare that to Canada. Cities like Vancouver and Toronto share a similar ethos. They, too, prioritize eco-friendly innovation, public transit, and green urban planning. The cultural overlap is hard to miss. But here's where the tension comes in. Oregon has increasingly felt out of sync with the rest of the U.S., especially during the Trump administration. Federal policies during that time clashed sharply with Oregon's values. While Oregon championed renewable energy, climate action, and social justice, the federal government rolled back environmental protections, ignored climate goals, and stoked division on issues like immigration and equity. For many Oregonians, these weren't just policy disagreements, they were deeply personal. Protests and marches became a regular occurrence, with people making it clear they felt alienated from Washington, D.C. Take Portland as a case study. The city thrives on values like equality, environmental action, and alternative transportation. Its bike culture is so robust it rivals Amsterdam, with miles of bike lanes crisscrossing the city. Public parks, compostable trash systems, and energy-efficient buildings are the norm. If you've been to Vancouver, you'd see the parallels immediately. Canadians wouldn't just understand Portland's quirky, eco-friendly vibe, they'd embrace it. Goat yoga? Pop-up art installations? Vegan food trucks? That's all very Vancouver-friendly. This sense of alignment isn't limited to Portland. The entire state shares a deep connection to nature, from its lush forests to its rugged coastline. Oregonians are fiercely protective of these landscapes, which became another flashpoint during the Trump years. Proposals for expanded logging and reduced environmental protections felt like an attack on the state's identity. For Oregonians, preserving their environment isn't just a policy, it's a way of life. Now, here's where things get interesting. When we surveyed 500 Oregonians, 361 of them said they'd support leaving the U.S., and 81% of those wanted to join Canada. That's a striking number, over two-thirds of respondents ready to trade stars and stripes for the maple leaf. It's not just a fringe idea, it's something a significant portion of the state finds appealing. These numbers underscore the depth of the cultural and political disconnect many Oregonians feel with the rest of the country. Geographically, the idea isn't as far-fetched as it might seem. Oregon is close to the Canadian border, with Washington state acting as a buffer. The cultural and coastal connections are strong, and economically, Oregon already has ties to Canada. Portland's port links the Pacific Northwest to international markets, many of which include Canadian companies. The relationship is already there, it's just a matter of imagining it on a larger scale. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Could Oregon actually pull this off? The logistical hurdles are enormous. Unlike Texas, Oregon doesn't have an established secessionist movement or legal mechanisms in place to leave the U.S. Separating from the federal government would mean untangling taxes, trade agreements, and infrastructure projects. And even if Oregon could leave, would joining Canada truly be a better fit, or is this just a case of the grass seeming greener on the other side? One thing is clear, many Oregonians feel disconnected from the U.S. right now. For a state that prides itself on individuality and creative problem-solving, looking north might feel like a natural extension of its progressive ideals, a river carving its own path, so to speak. While it's probably more of a fantasy than a serious movement, who's to say what the future holds? Stranger things have happened. And if you thought Oregon's 361 supporters for leaving was surprising, just wait. Their southern neighbor might be even more serious about independence. California's size, power, and history of secession dreams make it a completely different story. Let's dive into how the Golden State's frustrations with Washington have fueled its own Calexit ambitions. The Golden State's history of secession fantasies. California has always been a state that marches to the beat of its own drum. From its massive economy to its heavily progressive politics, it's no wonder the Golden State often feels out of sync with the rest of the country. And for some Californians, that feeling has turned into a desire to leave entirely. Over the years, the idea of California breaking away from the U.S. has gone from a fringe fantasy to a recurring conversation. But what's driving this sentiment now? To understand, let's look at the numbers. Out of 500 Californians surveyed, 423 said they'd leave the United States if given the chance. That's nearly 85%. And here's the kicker, 61% of them wouldn't just leave the US, they'd join Canada. These numbers don't just reflect dissatisfaction, they reveal a deeper cultural and political divide that's been simmering for decades. California's flirtation with independence isn't new. The state has long been a powerhouse, boasting the largest economy in the US and ranking as the fifth largest in the world if it were a country. Its influence spans technology, entertainment, agriculture, and renewable energy, making it feel, in many ways, like an independent entity already. But this isn't just about economic strength. For many Californians, the idea of leaving the U.S. is rooted in frustration with federal policies that often clash with the state's progressive values. And that tension has only grown in recent years. To understand why so many Californians are open to the idea of leaving, you have to look at the political clashes that have defined the state's relationship with Washington. California's progressive priorities often stand in stark contrast to federal policies. Take climate change, for example. California has some of the most aggressive climate goals in the world, leading the way in solar and wind energy production and enforcing strict emission standards. But during the Trump administration, the federal government rolled back environmental protections and doubled down on fossil fuels. California didn't just disagree, it fought back, suing the federal government more than 100 times, with climate policies at the center of many of those lawsuits. The message was clear: when federal decisions didn't align with California's values, the state wasn't going to stay silent. Immigration has been another major point of contention. California is home to one of the largest immigrant populations in the U.S., and its policies reflect that. Sanctuary cities, which limit local cooperation with federal immigration enforcement, are a cornerstone of California's approach to inclusion and diversity. But the Trump administration's hardline immigration policies created a tug-of-war between federal officials and state lawmakers. For many Californians, these policies felt like a rejection of the state's identity, further fueling the sense of alienation. Reproductive rights have also been a flashpoint. California has long been a safe haven for people seeking access to abortion and comprehensive reproductive health care, even as other states introduced more restrictions or outright bans. During the Trump years, the federal government openly opposed these protections, leaving California once again standing as a defiant outlier. These political tensions have given rise to movements like Calexit, which gained traction during the 2016 presidential election and the years that followed. While the idea of California becoming its own country might have started as a fringe concept, the growing political divide gave it momentum. For supporters, Calexit isn't just about leaving the US, it's about creating a nation that reflects California's values. Of course, the movement has faced skepticism, legal barriers, and logistical challenges, but it raises an important question: is California really that different from the rest of the US? For some, the idea of joining Canada feels more realistic than going solo. Culturally, there's already a sense of alignment. Canada has universal healthcare, a strong commitment to tackling climate change, and a welcoming stance on immigration, values that resonate deeply with many Californians. Plus, the economic ties are already there. From tech investments to agriculture exports, California and Canada work together in ways that feel like natural extensions of each other. Still, the idea of leaving the US is far from simple. Apart from the national resistance to letting a state like California go, there's the question of whether the people pushing these ideas are serious or simply venting their frustrations. For now, it seems more like a cultural statement than a concrete plan. But the numbers, 423 out of 500 surveyed Californians saying they'd leave, with 61% favoring Canada, send a strong message. They reflect a deep dissatisfaction with the status quo and a desire for policies that better align with California's values. The question isn't just whether California could make it on its own or with Canada, it's whether it would leave behind the sense of unity that defines the US. And while Californians might fantasize about it, the logistical and political challenges are no small hurdle. Still, it makes you wonder, if a powerhouse like California is questioning its place in the US, what does that say about the stability of the whole country? But not every state wants to move north. California's considering independence or Canada, but one state has its eyes on a completely different neighbor. Let's head to Arizona, where the pull to Mexico is sparking an entirely different kind of conversation. Arizona's surprising ties to Mexico. Arizona isn't looking north toward Canada like Vermont or Oregon. Instead, Arizona's focus is on Mexico. This makes sense when you consider the deep cultural, historical, and practical ties between the state and its southern neighbor. These connections set Arizona apart from most other states, making the idea of aligning more closely with Mexico feel less like a fantasy and more like a reflection of its unique identity. A significant factor in this connection is Arizona's large Latino population, which makes up about 32% of the state's residents. Many of these individuals have family ties in Mexico that span generations. For some, crossing the border to visit relatives, shop, or attend cultural events is a regular part of life. The border, in this sense, isn't a strict divider, it's more like a bridge linking two places with shared traditions, languages, and values. For many Arizonans of Mexican heritage, the cultural atmosphere in Mexico might feel more familiar than what they experience in other parts of the US. Geography reinforces this bond. Mexico isn't a distant country for Arizonans, it's right there. Cities like Tucson and Phoenix are just a few hours from the border, and towns like Nogales blur the line between the two nations. These border communities often feel like shared spaces, where life flows back and forth in a way that's hard to separate. This proximity and interconnection make it easier to imagine why some Arizonans might entertain the idea of officially joining Mexico. However, Arizona's political identity complicates the picture. The state has long been a conservative stronghold, with policies emphasizing gun rights and small government. At the same time, the growing Latino population has pushed for more progressive changes, particularly in areas like education, healthcare, and immigration reform. This tension has created a kind of identity crisis, leaving Arizona caught between opposing forces and uncertain about its future direction. Immigration is one of the most contentious issues in this divide. During the Trump administration, Arizona became a focal point for debates over border security and immigration policies. The increased presence of ICE, the push for a border wall, and policies targeting immigrant families hit home for many residents, especially those in the Latinx community. Families worried about loved ones being detained or deported, and communities lived in fear of raids and checkpoints. These experiences deepened a sense of disconnect between Arizona's residents and the federal government, particularly among those who felt unfairly targeted. Economically, Arizona's ties to Mexico are already strong. Cross-border trade generates billions of dollars annually, and Mexican workers are vital to industries like agriculture and hospitality. Many Arizonans also travel to Mexico for affordable medical care or beach vacations in Baja. These practical connections make the idea of a closer partnership, or even official alignment, with Mexico seem less far-fetched. But would it actually work? Transitioning from being a U.S. state to joining Mexico would be incredibly complex. Arizona's conservative population includes many who are deeply patriotic and resistant to the idea of leaving the U.S. The federal government would almost certainly oppose such a move, and integrating two very different political and economic systems would present significant challenges. While Mexico offers universal healthcare and a simpler lifestyle in some respects, aligning with it would require navigating these differences. Still, the idea resonates with many Arizonans. Out of 500 residents surveyed, over 60%, 301 people, said they'd prefer to leave the United States. Of those, 65% chose Mexico as their preferred destination. This isn't about joining Canada or becoming an independent state. For these individuals, it's about cultural and familial ties. Mexico isn't just a neighboring country, it's a place that feels welcoming, familiar, and, in some ways, like home. Arizona's situation is unique. Unlike states like Vermont or Oregon, which look north to Canada or dream of independence, Arizona's gaze is fixed southward. Its deep ties to Mexico, culturally, economically, and geographically, make this idea feel less like a political statement and more like an expression of identity. Whether this concept ever moves beyond casual conversations is uncertain, but the numbers don't lie. With 65% of those seeking change choosing Mexico, Arizona's distinct identity shines through. But Arizona isn't the only state with a complicated relationship with the U.S. Let's head to the Pacific, where one state's history as an independent kingdom could give it the strongest case for secession yet. Hawaii, a kingdom that never forgot. Hawaii is one of the most beautiful and culturally unique places in the United States, but its relationship with the U.S. has always been complicated. Unlike any other state, Hawaii was once an independent kingdom with its own monarchy, government, and distinct identity. It wasn't a colony or territory taken in the same way the U.S. expanded on the mainland, it was a sovereign nation. That history of independence still runs deep today, especially among native Hawaiians and long-term residents, and it shapes the state's ability to imagine a future where it might no longer be part of the United States. Hawaii's annexation by the U.S. in 1898 wasn't something the Hawaiian people voted for or agreed to. The overthrow of the Kingdom of Hawaii was widely protested at the time, and that tension between local sovereignty and federal control hasn't completely gone away. For many native Hawaiians, the annexation is seen as an act of cultural erasure, something that's hard to reconcile even many decades later. Efforts to preserve Hawaiian culture, language, and history remain a strong part of the island's identity, often in resistance to influences from the mainland. Modern politics have only added to this sense of disconnection. From environmental concerns to cultural preservation, Hawaii frequently finds itself at odds with federal policies and priorities. This tension became especially pronounced during the Trump administration, when many federal moves were seen as dismissive of what matters to Hawaii. One of the most infamous incidents tied to this period, the birther conspiracy, had a specific tie to Hawaii. During Barack Obama's presidency, conspiracy theories spread that questioned whether he was born in the U.S. or in Kenya. The irony? Obama was born in Honolulu, Hawaii's capital. While the conspiracy itself was absurd, the fact that it gained so much traction struck a nerve with people in Hawaii. It raised questions about whether Hawaii's legitimacy, culture, or place within the U.S. was still being questioned by mainlanders who didn't fully understand the state. Environmental stewardship is another area where Hawaii often clashes with federal decision-making. Hawaii is one of the most biodiverse and ecologically fragile places on Earth. Protecting its natural resources isn't just a priority for Hawaiians, it's a necessity for survival. Fishing waters, native forests, and even the skies above the islands are viewed as sacred spaces that need to be protected, both for cultural reasons and environmental ones. The Trump administration's push to roll back environmental regulations was seen by many Hawaiians as prioritizing corporate and mainland interests over the well-being of Hawaii's ecosystems. For residents, it felt like yet another example of Washington failing to understand the unique challenges Hawaii faces as a remote island state. Cultural preservation is equally critical. In Hawaii, there's a deep sense of pride in the traditions and customs of the indigenous people, but federal policies don't always prioritize those. Language programs, native rights, and cultural initiatives are often underfunded or inadequately supported by Washington, leaving Hawaiians feeling like they're fighting these battles alone. This struggle to maintain identity while being part of a larger system that doesn't share the same priorities is a recurring theme in Hawaii's relationship with the U.S. Hawaii's unique geographic position also plays a role in its sense of autonomy. Separated from the mainland by thousands of miles of ocean, Hawaii already functions somewhat independently. Its natural isolation gives it a cultural and economic autonomy that other states don't have. This independence, combined with its history as a sovereign kingdom, makes the idea of leaving the U.S. feel less far-fetched than it might for other states. When we surveyed 500 Hawaiians about the idea of leaving the United States, the results reflected this sense of disconnection. Out of those surveyed, 281 people, almost 56%, said they'd be interested in leaving. Of those, 60% said they'd choose Canada as their preferred destination. The draw? Canada's progressive environmental policies, healthcare system, and multicultural values align closely with Hawaii's priorities. For a state that often feels ignored or misunderstood by U.S. policymakers, a country like Canada, which shares similar values, might feel like a better match. Still, the idea of secession wouldn't come easily. Hawaii has deep ties to the U.S., not only politically but also economically, through tourism, military spending, and federal funding. Detaching from that infrastructure would be incredibly challenging. And then there's the human side of it. Hawaii has a diverse population, including many residents who feel fully American and connected to the mainland. Just because a portion of the population supports the idea doesn't mean the whole state would be on board. Even so, Hawaii's history as an independent kingdom gives it something no other state has, a precedent for sovereignty that's still alive in its identity. For people who feel disconnected from Washington's priorities or alienated by federal policies that don't fit the unique culture and values of the islands, the idea of walking away isn't as far-fetched as it might sound elsewhere. When you combine that history with modern frustrations, it's easy to see why people are willing to entertain these ideas, even if it's just hypothetically for now. What these numbers tell us is that Hawaii's connection to the U.S. is more fragile than it might seem at a glance. Whether or not the idea of separation gains traction, it's clear that Hawaii's identity and priorities don't always align with the mainland's leadership. It makes you wonder, as these cultural and political divides grow, will these tensions keep simmering, or could they boil over into something bigger? So, what's the takeaway? Across these states, a clear pattern emerges: each feels uniquely disconnected from federal policies, whether culturally, politically, or both. From Vermont's progressive leanings to Arizona's deep cultural ties to Mexico, these divides highlight a growing sense of misalignment within the nation. Could these fractures evolve into real secession movements? While the future remains uncertain, America's unity feels increasingly tested. This raises a bigger question: what do these trends mean for the nation's future? Could these cultural rifts reshape America's map sooner than we think? One thing's for sure, this conversation isn't fading anytime soon. What's your take?